It all started when I was offered the chance to be the head chef at a prestigious restaurant that had just opened. Being completely passionate about cooking, I accepted without thinking twice. It was the kind of opportunity one had always dreamed of. The place was stunning. State-of-the-art equipment, that sleek, minimalist decor that made you feel like you were in a luxurious environment just by looking at it. The clientele was the city's elite, people who came to experience the best money could buy. I felt like I was on top of the world. But during the first week, I noticed there was something a bit different, something slightly off about the restaurant. Every month, they organized something called a private experience, a night where only one customer was served. The restaurant would close its doors to everyone except that person. I always found it odd, but I was never involved in these events, so I didn't think much about it. They said it was an exclusive treatment that involved unique dishes. Of course, there was a lot of speculation among the staff about what exactly happened on these nights, but no one knew for sure. The only thing everyone knew was that the customer paid an enormous amount of money for this experience. The weird part? That customer never returned. After a month working there, the owner called me into his office. He told me that this time I would be in charge of preparing the main dish for the next private experience. Man, I was excited. I thought it was my chance to shine, to show what I was capable of. But what the owner said next made me feel uneasy. He started talking about the client for this experience, someone super influential in the city. Someone who, according to him, would pay a fortune to taste something truly special. Then he dropped the bomb. After that night, the customer would never come back to the restaurant. Like never again. He said it with a calmness that made me uncomfortable. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was a joke, but the guy was completely serious. He handed me a key and said I needed to get some ingredients from the basement. That's when things really started getting weird. I didn't even know there was a basement, let alone a locked freezer down there. The owner looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You'll find the rare meat down there. Just follow the instructions." I had no idea what to expect, but I went downstairs. It was a cold, dark hallway, a place that didn't seem to belong to that luxurious restaurant. The further I walked, the stronger the smell became. A metallic, pungent odor that made me feel queasy. When I finally reached the freezer, I already had a horrible feeling. And when I opened the door, my God, I'll never forget that sight. The moment I opened that freezer, the stench hit me like a wave, as if the air had become denser, making it almost impossible to breathe. It was so overpowering that I instinctively stepped back, like my body knew something was terribly wrong before my mind even understood what I was seeing. Inside, stacked on silver trays, were pieces of meat. But something about those cuts wasn't normal. I had worked with all kinds of meat before. I knew how to recognize a good cut of beef or pork, but these were different. The pieces had a strange shape, almost too familiar. I hesitantly moved closer, my heart racing. When I finally realized what I was looking at, my stomach turned. I recognized the shapes. These weren't just random pieces of meat. They were human parts. Arms, legs, ribs, all neatly butchered, as if prepared for a gourmet dish. But they were from people. My whole body froze. I stood there, staring, trying to process what it meant, but my brain refused to accept it. It was like my mind was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I slammed the freezer door shut, the sound echoing in the empty basement, and rushed back upstairs as fast as I could. My heart was pounding out of my chest. As I climbed the stairs, only one thought was running through my mind: confront the owner. Ask what the hell was going on in that place. When I got back to the office, the owner was there, calm as ever, like nothing had happened. He was talking to the client for that night, a well-dressed man, the kind you immediately recognize as powerful just by the way he carries himself. They were laughing, chatting like old friends. But I couldn't think about anything other than what I had just seen in the basement. I tried to speak, tried to ask what that was, but my voice came out weak, and the owner just looked at me with that cold smile and said calmly, "Did you find what you needed?" He knew. He knew what was down there, and he wasn't the least bit concerned about my shock. That's when he started talking about the restaurant's so-called tradition. With that same irritating calmness, he explained that the clients who participated in the Last Supper were special. They came to taste something unique, something they couldn't find anywhere else. And the most disturbing part? After savoring this dish, they never returned. Not because they didn't want to, but because after the meal, they became the next ingredient. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The client, sitting there, laughing and drinking, had no idea he would be the next to end up on one of those trays in the basement. Everything started to make sense in a terrifying way. The private experiences, the clients who never came back. They were eating human flesh, and then they became the next course. That's when the owner handed me a knife. "You have two options," he said, without losing that smile. "Either you prepare the dish, or you'll be the next one on one of those trays." I stood there, staring at the knife in my hand, my legs shaking. It was surreal. The client was sitting just a few feet away from me, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He smiled, drank the expensive wine the owner had offered, as if he was having one of the best nights of his life. But he had no idea this would be his last meal. The pressure was suffocating, and the owner just stood there, watching me, as if he knew exactly what I was going through. I felt like I had no choice. I could try to run, to get out of there and never come back, but where would I go? The owner knew me. He knew where I lived. If he controlled this place, who knew what else he had under his control? It was obvious he had powerful people on his side. I was trapped. I went back to the kitchen, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the knife. Every step felt heavy, and my heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my head. The kitchen, which used to be my refuge, the place where I felt alive, now felt like an execution chamber. The stainless steel walls, once gleaming, now felt cold and threatening. I could feel the owner's eyes on me, watching every move I made. So, I walked over to the table where the ingredients were waiting. Pieces of meat that now I knew exactly where they came from. I started preparing the dish, trying to push down the nausea. Every cut was a nightmare. My mind tried to separate what I was doing from the reality of it, but every time the knife touched the meat, the truth became clearer. I was preparing the last meal of a man who didn't even know what was happening. As I cooked, everything seemed to slow down. The sound of the oil in the pan, the noise of the knife against the cutting board, everything felt amplified in a disturbing way. The smell, which once brought me comfort and joy, now was unbearable. I tried not to think about the details, try not to think that this was human flesh, but it was impossible. Every move, every ingredient I added, it felt like a part of me was dying. Finally, the dish was ready. I plated the food, arranged everything as perfectly as I could. Ironic, right? Even knowing what was going on, I still cared about the presentation. But deep down, it was just a way to hold on to my sanity for a little longer. When I brought the plate to the customer, he smiled grateful. He had no idea. He looked at the food with admiration, complimented the aroma and appearance. That compliment, which once would have filled me with pride, now left me completely empty. He started eating, and each bite felt like a countdown. I stepped away, unable to watch, while he enjoyed the meal. I knew what would come next. I knew that once he finished, he would become the next ingredient. And I would be forced to repeat this horrible cycle, knowing that, eventually, I would be the one in his place. The night passed in a blur. When the customer finally left, satisfied and happy, I could only think of one thing. There was a tray waiting for me. I knew it was down there, waiting for me. I used to work on a small, cozy restaurant. Nothing fancy, just your typical family-owned place where locals hung out. You know the kind, right? Cheap beer, decent burgers, regulars that probably been sitting on the same bar stool for years. It was one of those spots where you'd get a mix of college kids and old-timers, which made the vibe kind of chill. But here's the thing. From the first week I was there, I noticed something was off. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Just small stuff, like the way the older staff, the ones who had been there for years, would sometimes go quiet when certain topics came up, especially when it came to talking about the old owner. His name was Martin, but you'd barely ever hear it mentioned. One night, we were closing up after a pretty busy shift, and one of the servers, an older guy named Pete, casually dropped something about Martin to the bartender, Linda. I didn't catch everything, but I heard enough. Pete said something like, "It still creeps me out the way Martin just vanished." Linda's face dropped. She shot Pete a look, like he'd just said something he really shouldn't have. Then she muttered something under her breath, and they quickly changed the subject. But I caught that word, vanished. Of course, I had to ask. So later that night, when it was just me and Linda, I asked her straight up, "What happened to the old owner, Martin?" I heard Pete mention something about him disappearing. She hesitated, then looked around like she didn't want anyone overhearing, even though the place was empty. "It's not something we talk about," she said, almost whispering. "But yeah, Martin, he just disappeared one night. No one knows what happened to him. He always stayed late, counting the money, locking up. And then one night, he didn't go home. I could see how uncomfortable it made her, so I didn't push for more details. But, man, you could feel it. The way people talked about it, or didn't talk about it, was weird. Like there was more to the story, but no one wanted to go there. At first, I didn't think much of it. People leave jobs all the time without warning. Maybe he just ran off, had problems, whatever. But the way everyone got all hush-hush about it, it made my skin crawl a little. And the fact that it was always the late shift that Martin had been working when he vanished, that stuck with me. That's when things started to feel a bit more real. I figured whatever it wasn't my problem. I was just a part-time worker trying to make rent, right? But deep down, I started feeling a bit uneasy whenever I closed up alone. Like I'd finish sweeping the floors or shutting off the lights and feel like someone was watching. Or something, right? So there I am, closing up on this random Tuesday night. The place had been dead for hours, no customers, no noise, just me and the quiet hum of the fridge in the back. I was moving through my usual routine, cleaning up tables, stacking chairs, the usual stuff. It was peaceful, if not a little too quiet. I mean, I'd always get this weird vibe when I was alone there late at night, but nothing I couldn't shake off. That night, though, something felt different. I had just finished taking out the trash, my mind on autopilot. When I heard it, those footsteps, at first, I thought it was one of the kitchen guys coming back to grab something they'd forgotten. It was just this light, almost casual sound like someone was walking around near the back office. But then it hit me. I was the last one in the building. I remember stopping mid-step, broom still in my hand, and just standing there for a second, listening. My brain was scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe one of the guys had stayed behind, and I just didn't notice? It seemed unlikely, but I convinced myself that had to be it. I mean, what else could it be, right? So I called out, "Hey, is someone still here?" Silence. Just the low buzz of the refrigerator. I waited a few more seconds, hoping someone would pop out and say, "Yeah, I'm just grabbing my keys," or something like that. But no, nothing. I shook it off, trying to act cool, but my heart was starting to pound a little. The thing is, those footsteps, there was no mistaking them. They were real. I heard them, clear as day. And they weren't just random noises you could chalk up to an old building settling or something. These were footsteps, slow and steady, like someone was walking with purpose. They stopped right outside the office. Now, I'll admit, I was freaked out, but I wasn't ready to go full-on panic mode yet. I grabbed the keys from under the counter, thinking maybe someone had locked themselves in or was playing some dumb prank. When I got to the office door, I paused for a second. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear this weird shuffling sound. It wasn't loud, but it was there, like something was being dragged across the floor. My hand was shaking when I put the key in the lock. I remember feeling this cold sweat run down my back, my brain screaming at me to just leave. But my curiosity, or maybe my stubbornness, kept me going. I twisted the key, and the lock clicked open with this loud thunk that made me jump. I pushed the door open, slowly. What I saw inside, man, I wish I hadn't. So, the door creaked open, and I remember standing there, frozen for what felt like forever. The office was dark, except for this faint light coming from the street lamp outside, casting these long shadows across the room. But that's not what hit me first. No. What hit me first was the smell. This thick, metallic scent of dried blood that instantly turned my stomach. I stepped inside, my feet almost refusing to move, and the sound I'd heard before, the dragging noise, suddenly made sense. There were streaks of dark, dried blood across the floor, like something had been pulled through it over and over again. And in the far corner of the room, there was this lump, a shape. It was covered with an old, dirty sheet, and I could see it moving just slightly like something underneath was twitching or shifting around. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood there, staring at that sheet, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, the sheet twitched again, and I swear I saw something crawl under it. I don't know why I did it, but I felt this compulsion to step closer, even though every instinct was telling me to turn around and run. When I was just a few feet away, I could see it clearly now, the outline of what looked like body parts under the sheet. Limbs twisted at weird angles like they didn't belong together. I remember whispering to myself, "This can't be real. This isn't happening." But I couldn't stop. I had to know. So, with my hand shaking so bad I thought I might drop it, I reached for the corner of the sheet. The moment I touched it, I felt this cold, clammy sensation shoot up my arm, like the air itself was colder under that fabric. I hesitated, but then I pulled it back. And there it was, the missing owner, Martin. Or what was left of him. His body was chopped up, dismembered, but here's the worst part. His parts were still moving. His hand twitched. His leg kicked, just slightly. His torso was jerking like it was trying to pull itself together. The blood was long dried, but his body, it wasn't done. It was like he was trying to piece himself back together, right there on the floor. I backed up so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to fight the urge to scream. I remember thinking, asterisk, this isn't real. This can't be happening, asterisk, but it was. And the whole time, his hand kept twitching, like it was trying to reach for me. I bolted out of that office, slammed the door behind me, and didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying what I saw, over and over. The next morning, I walked in and quit without saying much to anyone. I couldn't face that place again. I didn't tell a soul what happened in that office. And honestly, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me if I did. The weird thing? No one ever brought it up again. No investigation, no questions. It was like Martin's disappearance was just accepted as part of the restaurant's history, a rumor no one wanted to dig into. But I'll never forget what I saw. Those body parts still moving, trying to put themselves back together. And I never ever will come back to the restaurant. It all started 3 years ago. I was at the peak of my career as an independent food critic, always exploring the most hidden spots, the restaurants no one knew about. It was the kind of thing that gave me a certain fame in the scene. I'd find these lost gems in the city, and after that, everyone wanted to go there, as if I had some radar for culinary secrets. People trusted my palate and my stories. But the more I discovered, the more I craved something different, something new. That's when, out of nowhere, I received a letter. Not an email, text, or anything modern. A real letter, handwritten on expensive paper, with an old-fashioned, almost formal handwriting. That immediately caught my attention. Inside, there was a simple, direct, but at the same time, mysterious message. Come to the invisible restaurant. Coordinates below. That's it. No address, no sender. Just the coordinates. I remember standing there, holding that letter, staring at the paper, trying to figure out what was going on. Invisible restaurant? What did that even mean? There was no record of such a place in any of my contacts, and I knew all the hidden spots in the city. But you know how it is, curiosity's a curse. This seemed like exactly the kind of thing I needed to take my career to the next level. Imagine it. The food critic who discovered the city's most secret restaurant. So I went. The coordinates led me to a filthy alley, hidden behind an old building that looked like it came straight out of a horror movie. It gave me chills. There were no signs, no lights indicating a restaurant was there. Just a dead-end alley and a door. A small, discreet door so plain it would be easy to overlook. I looked around, half expecting someone to pop out from the shadows, or a hidden camera or something, but nothing. I took a deep breath and walked up to the door. I touched the handle, and, for a second, I hesitated. Something inside me was telling me to turn around and leave. But curiosity won. I turned the knob and stepped inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't a normal restaurant. I realized that right away. It was surreal. The place was immaculate. Tables perfectly set, soft lighting that cast strange shadows on the walls. But the most bizarre part was that the place was completely empty. No customers, no waiters, no one. The silence was so deep, I could hear my heart beating. And right in front of me, there was a single table set just for me. One chair, a folded napkin, utensils ready, and a menu. I looked at that menu, and the first thought that came to my mind was, what the hell is this? The words on the menu weren't what you'd expect in a restaurant. No dish names or descriptions of ingredients. Instead, just strange words like past, guilt, and sacrifice. I stared at it, thinking maybe it was some kind of artistic attempt at provoking philosophical reflection. But you know how it is, I was already there. I decided to order the first dish, past. At that moment, I had no idea what was about to happen. I ordered the dish, past, thinking I was about to taste something exotic, one of those extravagant chef creations that try to mix food with art. A few minutes passed. I didn't see anyone coming, no waiters, nothing. But suddenly, the dish appeared on my table. It was as if it had just materialized out of nowhere, you know? No noise, no footsteps. Just the plate, perfectly served. When I looked at the food, it seemed ordinary. Something I could find at any restaurant. But there was something off, something I couldn't explain. But I went ahead. I cut a piece and put it in my mouth, having no idea what was about to happen. As soon as the food touched my tongue, I was instantly transported to a memory from my childhood. But it wasn't just any memory. It was vivid. It was like I was back in that moment. Suddenly, I was 8 years old again. I was in my backyard playing with my dog, Toby. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the day I lost him. He ran out through the back door, and I never saw him again. In that moment, all the pain, the sense of loss, came rushing back with overwhelming force. I wasn't just remembering it. I was living it again, like I was back on the worst day of my childhood. I tried to stop eating, but I couldn't. Every bite pulled me deeper into that spiral of memories. It felt like I was trapped, reliving every detail. It wasn't just a memory. It was like the past was swallowing me whole. The sensation was so real. I could almost smell the grass in the yard, hear the sound of my footsteps running after Toby. But at the same time, I knew I was in the restaurant. It was a disturbing mix of two realities. As I ate, the memories shifted. Not all of them were bad. Some were happy, even joyful. But each one came with an intensity that made me lose track of the present. I was there living it all again, completely powerless. It was like watching a movie of my own life, but without the ability to pause or leave the theater. When the plate was finally empty, I was utterly exhausted. It was like my mind had been drained. I sat there at the table, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just food. It was like the dish had messed with my mind, forcing me to relive things I hadn't thought about in years. I was exhausted, as if every bite had drained a part of my soul. But even so, something was pushing me to continue. It was like I had no choice, like I was being pulled by an invisible force. The next dish on the menu was guilt. I hesitated for a moment, but deep down I knew I was too far in to stop. Without thinking too much, I ordered. This time, it took a little longer for the dish to appear. Again, no waiter, no one. Just the food there, in front of me, as if the place was reading my mind. The dish looked heavier, denser. I couldn't tell what the ingredients were, and honestly, I didn't even want to know. But I was already so deep in this nightmare that when I took the first bite, everything changed again. The moment the food touched my tongue, an unbearable weight settled on me. It was as if the air around me had thickened, grown more suffocating. Suddenly, I felt a guilt so strong it was overwhelming. It wasn't just an ordinary feeling. It was crushing, like a ton of regrets had fallen on me all at once. The worst part was it was for things I didn't even remember. Small mistakes, bad decisions, moments where I hurt people without even realizing it. Everything was there, hitting me like a hammer. With every bite, new images flashed through my mind. I saw the time I betrayed a friend's trust, a dumb teenage mistake I'd completely forgotten about. Then another scene, the fight with my parents before I left home. In that moment, every harsh word I'd spoken came back with brutal clarity. It felt like I was trapped in those memories, unable to escape. And then, the shadows in the restaurant started to move. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the walls seemed to be closing in like the whole place was alive. The lights grew dimmer, and the silence was so thick I could hear the blood rushing through my veins. The feeling of being watched grew stronger and stronger. That's when I saw something in the reflection of the windows. Until then, They had been completely dark, reflecting only the emptiness of the restaurant. But now I could see silhouettes, human shapes, sitting at the tables around me, still. They had been there the whole time. I just couldn't see them before. Pale, blurred figures like ghosts trapped in that place. The worst part? They were all staring right at me. Fear hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood up trying to get out of there as fast as I could. I ran to the door, but it wasn't there anymore. Where there had once been an exit, there was now just a smooth wall, no way out. The restaurant had changed, as if it was trapping me. I looked around, panicked, trying to make sense of what was happening, but all I found was more darkness. The menu on the table now showed only one word: sacrifice. I knew there was no way out now. I stood there, staring at the menu with that damned word, sacrifice. My hands were shaking. The restaurant, which had already seemed strange, was now suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. Everything around me was darker, the shadows heavier, and the silence so deep it felt like any sound I made would echo forever. Those figures at the tables, I could feel they were waiting for something. The problem was I knew I couldn't leave. The door had disappeared, and the windows only showed a pitch-black void, as if the restaurant no longer existed in the real world. It felt like I had been pulled into another dimension, a place where time and space didn't make sense anymore. But no matter how much panic was building inside me, something told me I had to finish the meal. It was like I was being tested, and if I stopped now, the consequences would be far worse. With sweaty hands, I called for the final dish: sacrifice. This time, the dish appeared immediately, with no delay. It was different from the others. The food looked raw, almost bloody, with a metallic smell that made me nauseous just by breathing it in. Something was deeply wrong with it. But what terrified me most was the feeling of being watched. And it wasn't just a vague feeling, it was intense, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. But when I turned around, there was no one, or rather no one visible. I took a deep breath and grabbed the fork. I knew if I hesitated, things would only get worse. I took the first bite, expecting it to be horrible. And in a way it was, but not in the way I had thought. The moment the food slid down my throat, my vision began to darken. It wasn't like fainting, it was more like being sucked into a black hole. Everything around me vanished. The tables, the shadows, even the sound of my own breathing, everything was erased. And then I was in another place. It was a dark, cold space like an endless cave. Around me, voices whispered. Thousands of them, all at once, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. They seemed to come from every direction, filling my head to the point of madness. And then, images began flooding my mind. They were my memories, but those of other people. Scenes of pain, regret, despair. People sitting at the same table where I had been, staring at the same menu, living the same nightmare. I could see their faces, one by one, all trapped in that cycle of suffering. And the truth finally hit me. Everyone who had come before me was there, trapped in this place, doomed to repeat the same cycle forever. They were the silhouettes, the figures at the tables. And now, I was one of them too. The food, the dishes, the restaurant, it was all a trap. An endless cycle that fed on the souls of those who dared to enter. And the worst part was the certainty that I would never leave. I would be one of those invisible presences, watching, waiting, until the next unsuspecting victim fell into the same trap. I was lost forever. I worked at this restaurant, you know? It wasn't some fancy five-star place, but it was popular. People came from all over town just to try the food. But the real mystery about the place? The chef. No one ever saw him. I mean, literally no one. Not the staff, not the customers. He never left the kitchen. There were always rumors about him. Some people said he was just shy. Others said he was a total recluse who hated people. But the strangest part was this rule he had. The kitchen had to be silent. Absolutely dead silent while he was cooking. No clanging of pots, no talking, no footsteps. The second there was noise, the dish would be ruined, and he wouldn't serve it. Ever heard of something that weird? The assistant was the only one who dealt with him directly. We never asked too many questions, you know? Why bother? The food was amazing, and the place was always busy. Plus, nobody wanted to mess with whatever system they had going on. But the thing is, the assistant never seemed all that happy either. I mean, he did his job, but there was always this weird tension in the air when he talked about the chef. Like he didn't really want to be there. Anyway, most nights, I was stuck with closing duties. After the last customers left, I'd be the one cleaning up, locking the place down. Normally, it was uneventful, just your typical wiping down tables, taking out the trash, turning off the lights. But that night, it was different. So there I was, just about to lock the door, when I heard this faint noise coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought I was hearing things, you know? I mean, the place was empty. The assistant had left like half an hour earlier, and the chef? Well, he never left the kitchen, but it wasn't like he'd be hanging around after close. I stood there for a second, listening. The noise wasn't constant. It was like metal scraping against something. Not loud, just this slow, eerie sound that echoed in the silence of the restaurant. My first thought was that maybe the assistant forgot to shut something off, like a fan or an appliance. But then the scraping got louder, like something or someone was deliberately dragging a knife along a counter. I'll be honest, my gut was telling me not to check it out, but I couldn't just leave it. So I walked toward the kitchen, every step feeling heavier, like I didn't want to get there, but something was pulling me in. The closer I got, the clearer the sound became. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like someone was moving in slow, deliberate motions. When I pushed open the kitchen door, the lights were dim, not completely off, but low enough to cast long shadows. And then I saw it, a figure standing by the stove, hunched over, stirring something in a pot. My first thought? It had to be the assistant. Who else could it be, right? But something felt off. The assistant never stayed this late, and he definitely didn't move like that, so slow, almost robotic. I called out his name, hoping for some normal response like, "Oh hey, I forgot something." But no, nothing. The figure just kept stirring, moving that spoon in slow circles like he didn't even hear me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that thing. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body felt like it was glued to the floor. The air in the kitchen had this heavy, suffocating feel, like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My mind was spinning. All I could focus on was that faceless head, and the fact that it was standing so still, like it was just waiting. Then, the thing took a step toward me. I snapped out of my daze and stumbled back, knocking over a stack of pans. The loud clang echoed through the kitchen, and that's when it reacted. Fast. Too fast. It lunged at me, closing the distance in a second, and I barely managed to dodge out of the way. I could feel the air shift as it swiped at me with one of its hands, or claws, or whatever those things were. They weren't normal hands, that's for sure. They looked sharp, long, and bloody. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs feeling like jelly. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to see how close it was behind me. All I could hear was this sickening, wet breathing like it was right on my heels. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I tore through the dining room, knocking over chairs and tables, just trying to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The screeching sound from earlier, like the knife dragging on metal, it followed me. It was this horrible noise that made my skin crawl. It was almost like the thing was trying to drive me insane with that sound. When I finally reached the front door, my hands were shaking so bad, I couldn't get the key to turn. My mind was racing, panicking. I could hear that thing getting closer, its footsteps now heavy and deliberate, like it knew I had nowhere to go. Somehow, I managed to unlock the door, throwing it open and bolting outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, gasping for breath, my legs burning. Only then did I glance back at the restaurant. It was dark and still. No movement. No sounds. Just an empty building. For a second, I almost thought I'd imagined the whole thing, like maybe it was some sick nightmare or my mind playing tricks on me. But then I remembered the smell, the sight of that pot filled with human remains. There was no way I was making that up. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind kept replaying what I saw, what I ran from. The next morning, I called the owner and quit. I didn't even try to explain. I just said I was done. A few days later, I heard the restaurant had closed down without warning. No explanation, no notice. Just shut its doors for good. And the weirdest part? No one ever saw the assistant or any of the staff again. It was like they vanished. I never spoke about it to anyone. Who would believe me? But to this day, I can't walk past that place without feeling a chill run down my spine. Whatever was in that kitchen, it wasn't human, and I'm just glad I got out before I ended up on the menu.